The title of our message this morning is Make Time to Hear God's Voice. Make time to hear God's voice. Well, how do we do that? Well, I think the prophet Habakkuk in the Old Testament helps us a great deal in this regard. I just want to give you a very brief summary of his ministry, a background, just so that we understand the circumstances he was in, and that'll help us to better understand his response. Now, at the time of Habakkuk's writing, King Jehoiakim of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, he was in charge, he was the ruler. He was an evil tyrant, harsh ruler, oppressing the poor, mistreating the prophets, and he misled the nation into sin and evil and immorality. He was at the time a vassal of Babylon. If you know what that means, is that Babylon had conquered him and he had to pay the king of Babylon a certain sum of money every year to make sure that he had his protection. It was protection money. The mafia had been around a long time, only they didn't go under that name. So it was protection money he had to pay. Well, one day some of his mates from Egypt, some political connections he had in Egypt, came to him, and they were also a vassal of Babylon's, and they said, "We've had enough, let's chuck this guy out, let's get rid of him, let's rebel against him." Jehoiakim lent his ears out to these political allies of his, and he rebelled against Babylon. And unknown to him or to the country or to anyone else, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had decided he was going to attack Jerusalem, and he was going to teach them a lesson they would never forget. And these are the circumstances under which Habakkuk lived. And one of the things that troubled him very deeply was the moral decline of God's people. And what troubled him about the moral decline of God's people was that God didn't seem to be doing anything about it. It just seemed to be going on and on. It was a never-ending story. It was a Zuma and a Zuma and a Zuma and another Zuma. It just went on and on. And so Habakkuk took his troubling questions to God, looking for answers, except that he didn't quite get the answers that he expected. He introduces his book with a very brief sentence. He calls it his oracle, and then he fires 4 questions like a machine gun at God. And here they are. He says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong?" And the questions that trouble Habakkuk, these questions trouble us as well. And they all boil down to this one question: why does God tolerate evil? Why does he tolerate it? And some well-known songs reflect our desire to banish evil so we can all live as one big happy family. And one of those songs is John Lennon's Imagine. You remember it? Imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try, no hell below us, above only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. That's the dream. We all dream of living in a perfect world where there's no hurt, no pain, no sin, no crookery. And many times most of us wish the world wasn't as it is. And yet it is. We can't deny the hard facts that life and the world are not what we wish they were. But why is the world as it is? And why doesn't God do something to make it better, to change it? The world has been a mess ever since Adam and Eve took that first bite of the apple. And history shows that it's only the depth of the mess that varies. The mess never goes away. Every generation faces a mess. And what troubled Habakkuk is how a holy, righteous God, an almighty God, a God who could create the world, who could do anything, could sit back, seemingly with his arms folded, and do nothing to challenge evil and make the world a better place. Why didn't he send a bolt of lightning to zap the bad guys, cleanse the world of evil, get rid of it once and for all, stop bad things happening? How can he tolerate evil in a world that he created, which after he created, he said it was good? But now it's overrun with extortion, bribery and corruption and every sin imaginable. Why can't the world be the way John Lennon imagined it? All the people sharing the world, everybody as one. If only the world will be what we imagine it should be. And you know, Habakkuk expressed these same thoughts in different words, but these same thoughts to God. And then he waited, and God replied. He answered Habakkuk's questions, and this is how he answered them. He said, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your time that even if you were told, you would not believe it. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are feared and a dreaded people. They are a law unto themselves and promote only their own honor." You know, when Habakkuk heard that, he got a shock. Because God was saying, I'm going to use these evil people, who are even more evil than Judah, to punish Judah. God was planning to deal with the evil and corruption that troubled Habakkuk through an instrument that was far more evil than Judah itself. And that troubled Habakkuk, that a holy God could use an evil nation to punish his people. The least he could do, surely, was to use a righteous nation. God was right, you know, when he told Habakkuk, you won't even believe it, even if you have first-hand knowledge. He was right. God's proposed solution to deal with the evil among his own people raised even more serious questions in Habakkuk's mind. It confused him more about this holy, righteous God. He said, O Lord, are you not from everlasting, my God, my Holy One? We will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. How can you use this evil nation when you are so holy, when you can't even bear to look at evil? Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Habakkuk was horrified at what God was planning. He thought it completely contradicted God's holy character. How could a holy God punish his people through an unholy instrument? Surely that's beyond God. God wouldn't do that. We often say, well, God is love. He would never do this. He would never do that. How often haven't we disciplined our children or even punished them when they were younger? Because we hated them? No. Because we loved them. Because we loved them. Couldn't a just God at least punish Judah through a righteous nation? Well, in World War II, in his commentary, J. Sidlow Baxter was writing his commentary on Habakkuk during World War II. And he saw a parallel here. Now, it may not be true, but he wondered whether it might not be so. He didn't say it was. He said he wondered whether it might not be so. Could it be possible that God was punishing Europe for her sins by using an even more evil instrument, Adolf Hitler, to do the punishing? He didn't say it was so. He said the thought crossed his mind. And the question why God runs the world as he does, why he permits some things, why he works things out as he does, beyond our reasoning, beyond our understanding, these things trouble us. And the reason they trouble us is because we have a hard time seeing things from God's perspective. Just like Isaiah says in Isaiah 55 verse 8, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And to use a well-known expression, God is saying to us through Isaiah, if you can't see things my way, it's because you're not on the same page as I am. So how did God help Habakkuk get onto the same page as God? Up to this point, what God said to Habakkuk made no sense to him. So he did the one thing that was left to him. He'd asked all the questions. He challenged God. He called God to account. How can you do this? He did the one thing that he could. He stopped talking and he started listening for God's voice. He was still perplexed. He said so. But he still had sufficient faith and grace to say this: I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. I will look to see what he will say to me. We must make time to listen to God. I don't think God has a problem with the questions that trouble us, unless those questions throw us off balance, or drown out his voice, or deprive us of his unspeakable peace. Sometimes we listen to God with half an ear, but Habakkuk never made that mistake. He gave God his full attention. Now recently, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 7 has spoken a deep word into my spirit. And it was from the Translator's New Testament, which is one of the versions that I have had for many years and appreciated. And that translation says, in Hebrews 11 verse 7, Noah listened carefully to what God said and built the ark to save his household. Noah listened carefully to what God said. How often we listening to all these other voices, the voice of our fears, the voice of some perceived threat that we might feel, that we might sense, the voice of our own insecurities, that voice that just, those voices that just create turmoil in our minds and rob us of God's peace. And the one voice that we need to listen to is drowned out by all these other voices. Make time to listen to God. Habakkuk knew he didn't have the answers to his own perplexing questions. And if he was going to get any answers, he'd have to stop talking, stop asking these questions, and listen to hear what God had to say. Famous concert pianist once said that a good audience is an audience that concentrates. He said people don't realize that you can actually hear them coughing while you're playing. And he said, I can hear their cough as clearly as they can hear my playing. And he said there are times when an audience has to be told to be silent. He said once he was playing a very soft passage to this large audience, and he stopped in the middle of that passage and said, I can hear you, but you can't hear me. He said the result was absolute silence. Someone said the person preparing to hear God's voice must be silent. Totally silent, and the place must be silent too. He said this silence is hard to come by in our culture that turns everything into noise. A culture for which the poet R.S. Thomas wrote this epitaph: because silence is golden, I broke it. Even in church, golden silence is broken, often by word and song being ratcheted up to the decibel level of some bars. Thomas, the poet R.S. Thomas, preferred empty churches. He used to visit empty churches, silent churches. He said the reason for that is because I stopped to listen. When I was a very young Christian, I worked near the old cathedral that I used to attend occasionally as a youngster. Those days they left the cathedral doors open. Anybody could go in, pray, just sit there in the silence of this large sanctuary. And you know those old Anglican sanctuaries, they have such a sense of reverence about them. And that's why I went there, excuse me. That's why I went there. I could sense God. And I was quiet. I quietened my heart. And I listened. And sometimes I would take my Bible and I would read and I would listen for God's voice in the silence of the sanctuary. We hear God's voice in the silence. Why silence? Because silence creates an atmosphere of reverence and of receptivity. We've quietened all these other voices and we're listening only for that one voice. And silence helps us to do that. The discipline of silence. Perhaps our greatest need, or one of our greatest needs in our generation, is the need to discipline ourselves to be silent. You know, we are bombarded with speech and text and video images from every angle, day and night. We have to learn to discipline ourselves to be silent before God. If we want to hear God's voice, we have to silence every other voice that is clamoring for our attention. Well, what did Habakkuk hear God say? Very briefly, I'm going to give them to you in bullet point form. He heard Habakkuk heard God say, the Babylonians are not going to get a free pass. They are just as guilty, and they will be punished just as Judah is being punished. I will punish them. And you know, God did punish them. Nebuchadnezzar had a great dream. In fact, in one of his prayers to his god Marduk, he asked his God that his exploits would last forever. Ironically, Nebuchadnezzar's exploits and his reign lasted only 22 years. And it was over. God punished him, punished the nation. And you know, Nebuchadnezzar, and the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had for his reign to last 1,000 years, forever, or 1,000 years, because 1,000 years is symbolic for forever and ever, is very much the same, was very much the same as Hitler's nightmarish dream that the Third Reich would last 1,000 years. And it didn't. In 12 years, Hitler was dead, and the nightmare dream that he had died with him. You see, evil carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Well, then God said something else to Habakkuk. He said, "But the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent before him." God said to Habakkuk, I'm in control of my world. I know what's going on in it, and I know how to deal with it. I don't need anyone's advice. I certainly don't need yours. I know how to run my world. And God told Habakkuk not to be anxious about matters over which he had no control, and over which only God could do something. And then the third thing that God said to Habakkuk, and I call this the bottom line. And I think it was more of a reminder to Habakkuk than it was a new lesson. You know, when we get into new circumstances and our circumstances change and they become more challenging, we don't have to learn the new lessons. We just have to learn to apply the old lessons that we've learned already. And so God was reminding Habakkuk of something. And what are these lessons? You know, so much in the Bible is revision work. Throughout the Bible we find the same lessons repeated in different ways through different people in different circumstances, but always the same two lessons. Faith and obedience. Always the same two lessons. It's not that you don't know them. You've applied them in the past in other circumstances, trying circumstances. God reminds us through his word to apply them in these circumstances. Not a new lesson. An old one we already know. And what was God's reminder to Habakkuk? In chapter 2 verse 4, he said to Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. How are you going to live your life with God? In any circumstance. The just shall live by faith. This is the pinnacle of this message. 3 chapters, but here is the heart of it. We're at the heart of it. When Habakkuk heard that and he accepted it, and he knew that God was going to discipline and punish a disobedient people, he said, I heard and my heart pounded and my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. But he didn't stop there. He went on. And this is where his faith came into play. These words that I'm going to read now from Habakkuk are some of the greatest expressions of faith you'll find in the Bible. Habakkuk said, although he was shaking in his boots and he trembled with fear, he said, yet, despite all that, I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Saviour. You know, there are only two other expressions of faith in the Bible that are on a par with this. And they are the words of Job, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. And the words of Jesus on the cross, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. These are the three greatest statements of faith in the Bible. Habakkuk said, my sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. You've seen those documentaries of those mountain goats. They climb rocky, steep, rocky inclines that are like that. How they manage, I don't know. But this is what Habakkuk's saying. He's saying, I'm on a precipice. It's a craggy, steep incline, rocky, dangerous. But God enables me to climb that. He enables me to climb it. And no matter where life takes us, no matter what experiences we find ourselves in the midst of, our walk with God is always a walk of faith and obedience. It never changes. The old lessons always applied in the new circumstances. They worked then and they work now. And they'll work in the future because they are God's principles. Now, many scholars believe that the Hebrew word that Habakkuk uses for his faith can also be translated as his faithfulness. In other words, your faithfulness and my faithfulness to God. We mustn't always expect that God's going to come to the party, but we can pass on this one. That he must be loyal to us, but we don't have to be loyal to him. What is faith? Faith is life in communion, in union, in fellowship, and total dependence on God. Well, how do you know when you have faith in God? Surely your faithfulness to God proves that you have faith in God. Now Habakkuk didn't just leave it there. He had a concern. He wasn't just content to let God punish his people. He had a concern, and this was his concern. After he had heard God's voice, he prayed this prayer. In the midst of these years, Lord, revive your work. Bring it back to life. Bring it back to life. God is not just content to discipline his church, to discipline his people. He wants to inject the life of his Holy Spirit into us, that we might do his work and he might revive his work in our midst, in these terrible years, in these circumstances in which we find ourselves. Wesley's England was a disaster, a gin-drinking, thieving, conniving nation. But Wesley and many others like him, George Whitefield and many other great men that we read, men of God we read about, heard God's voice. And they followed his voice. See, that's the reason why we need to hear God's voice, so we can follow God's voice, leading us where he is going. And as a result of Wesley and Whitefield hearing God's voice, England was saved. God renewed his work in their day. And God can renew his work in South Africa in our day. I believe it with all my heart that he wants to, that he can, that he's going to. But I have to hear his voice and follow his voice for him to do so. And in the midst of our personal concerns and perplexities, we must learn to follow Habakkuk, quieten our hearts and our minds, and we will hear God say to us, "The just shall live by faith." And then our hearts and minds will rest in God's peace in the midst of all the concerns we have, because we have made time to hear God's voice. God bless you all.